Okay, good. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's this strange concept of digital conferences. And so what I wanted to share with you today a bit is about structure and randomness and trained networks. And let's see how this all connects. Yeah, if there are questions, then just let me know. So first, I want to linger a bit about the title of my talk, this structure and randomness, and it sort of seems natural, but in a sense, one can ask why do we want this? Why should we care about structure and randomness? And it has sort of a normative flavor to it. Sounds a bit like order from chaos. You can even think of biblical connotations, understanding from confusion, or simplicity for complexity. All of this is, in a sense, what science aims to do, right? We observe complex phenomena and we try to make simple explanations of them that sort of capture the essence. In a sense, models are all about extracting structure from what will be an apparent randomness or something that is complex, and we want to try and understand it. And but the word simple, of course, is not well defined. So one could think of simple models as those that explain a component of the system. Now, this component doesn't have to be, it can be a physical component, but it can also be a functional component. So it can be a certain function the system has, or an actual anatomical component. And then the idea is usually that if we understand this component in isolation, and later we embed it back into the full system, functionality is retained. I mean, it can, of course, interact with other components, but this essence that we understood of this component in isolation, the simplicity of it, still helps us to understand what goes on when we put it back into the full system. But is that the case? So in neuroscience, at least, one common theme, that one common component is a single neuron. So when people look at single neurons, for instance, in V1, and have studied them for quite a while, even before 2004, then there were receptive fields and orientation selectivity. And when people try to understand this famous work by Olshausen and Field, how much do we, so if we know this simple part, if we know how the visual cortex neurons respond to all the stimuli that we gave them, and now we try to understand, let's say, natural vision with it, how much do we know? And their conclusion was that not much. In the auditory cortex, a very similar conclusion was reached when trying to look at the auditory receptive field, the spectrotemporal receptive fields, and then looking at more natural stimuli. And again, this didn't go so well. And this sort of goes on and on. So work that I was involved with by Mattia Rigotti and Stefano Fuzzi, using data from early Mirror's lab, then you could see that neurons respond in a selective manner to certain visual stimuli, but this selectivity is highly modulated by the context. So the neuron can respond if this is in the context of recognition task, but not in the context of recall task. So had you only observed the neuron during a recognition task, you might have reached the conclusion that you know what this neuron does. But now when you move to another context, suddenly the information gained in context A is no longer so valuable. This is also true in work that I did analyzing data from the Romo lab, where this tuning curves were done both during the stimulus and during a delay period. And you can see that while there is a correlation, about a third of the neurons sit sort of in the wrong quadrants. So a neuron that is positively tuned in one epoch of the task is then negatively tuned in another. What all of these examples show is that these parts or these components that are often used in neuroscience do not retain their properties when they are put together into the big system. And that sort of leads us to search for new simple parts. And what I want to talk about today is one type of approach that might lead to such new principles, to such new structures in the complexity. So here's a caricature of how one might use simple parts to construct a model. And it goes sort of like this. You observe a behavior, let's say a certain task, and then you, that has a computation involved, or some sort of a, in a sense you could say there's a problem that the animal solves. And then in order to understand how the animal solves this problem, you identify the relevant components. Let's say if it's identifying a visual image, then you might say, well, the neurons that observe that are sensitive to various orientations are definitely relevant components, right? So visual cortex neurons should be relevant to identify a car from a cat. And now, using some insight, you try to think how these components that you identified and characterized are connected together to support the functionality. This is an hypothesis, And now, let's say if you're in the business of high-dimensional dynamics, then you put this, you implement this in a neural network that has many neurons and has certain dynamics that you can then compare to neural data. And in recent years, there's another approach, which is the machine learning approach, which sort of throws away all of this identifying and insight and understanding how things work, and just says, well, let's take image recognition or memory, and let's just have a network and turn the crank, and out comes a network that performs a task, and let's compare that to neural data, with of course this small caveat that we skipped the whole insight and hypothesis phase, and therefore one might think that we have no clue what we ended up with. Luckily, in some cases, it is possible to reverse engineer this and sort of discover the underlying hypothesis that came about here. And so this could seem that a bit of a let's say, highly indirect approach of doing science. And I want to slightly try to convince you that it's worthwhile. So why train networks? And basically two reasons. One, I think it fits the data better than the sort of standard models. And two, we can learn something from it. Ideally, these new forms of understanding, we might be able to learn them. So it fits the data better. Actually, I will devote very little to this today, but this is both of my work and others. This is an example from the Romo data. So here is the scatter plot I showed you before of consistency of tuning curves. So this is the tuning curve during a stimulus versus during the delay. And you see the scatter plot. The curves here try to sort of do this over time of many points compared to one another. And you can see that, let's say, a network that has the correct components wired together in the correct way will have, by definition, very consistent tuning, whereas a trained network will have a profile that is more similar to that observed in data. Similarly, this is from the Ganguly lab, where they trained networks to replicate the Retina response, and that was closer to the actual physiology than relying on sort of more classical tuning curves. And this has been done in many areas by now, in motor cortex, using timing, vision, auditory. And the gist of it, I would say, is that these type of networks naturally capture, let's say, the messiness of the biological recording. That when you start with sort of the if you look at 1,000 neurons and then you try to make sense of them, then you might be biased to choosing sort of the clean ones and the ones that make sense individually. And then you build a model by connecting those nice neurons to one another, and you end up with a nice network. When you start the other way around with a random network that you train, then if it works, you get something that is both messy and therefore maybe like biology and also works. But this, you could just add noise. I mean, why go through all this trouble? So hopefully we can also learn something in the process. And so let's try to understand these networks. And so one analogy that I think Robert Young made, and David Cecilio and others, is that you can think of these as a model organism. So that's sort of just one thing to keep in mind, which I think is nice, that in biology we have many models, right? So a mouse is sometimes a model, a human is sometimes a model. I mean, many things are a model. And whenever you make a model, either biological or in silicon, you sacrifice some realism and you gain tools. And my claim is that obviously you have more tools when the entire network is at your disposal in the computer. And my claim is that you don't sacrifice all of reality in the process. And when you study this, there are two sort of fundamentally different or conceptually different things that one can study. One is the final network. So you have a task, you train a network, and then you observe and analyze the final outcome of this. The other is the learning process itself that's also accessible to you. And for instance, you could be surprised by the solutions a network finds to a task. Maybe this is something you did not think of. Or even if you're not surprised by the result, you might gain some insight on the process of learning itself. And there's a nice citation, a quote from Richard Sutton, where he said that if we build in our discoveries, it makes it harder to see the discovering process itself. Okay, so if we study the process of learning, then that can also give us some insights. And I'm going to partially talk about both things now. Okay, so I want to briefly describe two projects that touch upon these things. And the first is by Tia, a recent graduate from the lab. He finished his PhD this year. And this was virtually published in ICLR. And the task is the following. This is a navigation task inspired by the water maze. So there's an agent that is in a square arena, and there's a certain goal. The agent starts in some random initial position, and it is controlled by a recurrent network that is initialized in a random hidden state. And there's a context which tells the agent which of two different targets are active in the current trial. The agent only receives proximal input, so you can think of it as somatosensory if you're in the dark. And then it has to move about and locate the target. And obviously it has to bump into the walls to know where it is. And our focus here was on what types of internal representations are necessary to solve this task and how they may come about. So what we did to that is we did a two-stage learning. So first, we just let the agent run around in the maze, in the arena, without a task. So there was no goal. And this was sort of akin to evolution or development. There was no task here, but we try to emphasize a certain internal representation. And this was either memory of landmark memory. So this was the memnet, where the network was encouraged to remember the identity of the last wall encountered, north, south, east, west, or path integration, the POSNet position, where the network was encouraged to remember the actual position of the agent while it was running around. So this was modifying the internal connectivity of the network without any task. Then we trained, using Q-learning, we trained a task using only the output, the readout of the network. And the task could either be more, let's say, topological in nature, so we scale the arena from different trials, or more metric in nature, so we put obstacles. And when we take these networks, we see that the network that was pushed toward the more landmark, task found a topological solution. It found a solution that did not rely on absolute position. Whereas other networks found a more metric-like solution. And if we then use a host of tasks, we can define a topology score and a metric score. And we see that random networks, these are the blue ones, are able to solve it somewhat. But the pre-trained networks are both better, so they move, let's say, in the direction of better performance, but also sort of the position network moves in one direction, the memory network, the landmark, moves in the other direction. And then the question was, what happened here? So how did this come about? And the idea is that pre-training creates dynamical objects. And to find these dynamical objects, we wanted to find what's known slow points in the network. So this is based on work I did with David Cicillo. So if there's a fixed point in dynamics, then this scalar function has a 0 in phase space. And if it's not a true fixed point, but only sort of approximately fixed, then we expect small values of this function. So when we look at these slow points in a random network, we get large numbers. This is the distribution, whereas the trained networks, these pre-trained for position or memory, have much lower, so they seem to really have slow points and slower ones for the memory network. And now we look at the topology of them, and we see that the position network created a 2D manifold of slow points, whereas the memory network created 4 distinct fixed points or semi-fixed points for the memory. So what we can think of is that A, trained networks have slow points and not fixed points. They create approximate objects. And B, learning shapes the dynamics of the network that then shapes the learning that will take place in the next time. So it's a dynamical process. This is a recurrent network, right? So when you learn something, it changes the dynamics that will affect the learning that goes on next. And to understand how these objects form and how learning appears in a more exact manner, we turn to a more tractable problem. This is work done by Friedrich Schussler. He's a PhD student in the lab in collaboration with Serge Ostojic, Alexis Dubreuil, and Francesca Mastrogiuseppe. And the idea here is that we are going to train networks using gradient descent without any constraint. And we start with some random connectivity. By definition, after we train it, there's going to be some delta to the connectivity. And we're going to analyze this delta of the connectivity and try to understand whether it has any structure and why. So here's an example. There's a task, the delay discrimination task from the Romo lab, for instance, 2 inputs separated by a delay. And the task is to know whether the second one is larger than the first one. And the network learns this. And now I first want you to concentrate on the dark shading. So this is a case where the initial structure, the random part, is 0. So there is no initial connectivity. And you see, so this is loss over time, over training time, and it takes it quite a while, but eventually it gets it. If, on the other hand, we do have initial connectivity, and this is the G. So G here is just saying that This is taken from random with g squared over n variance. So this is just the scale of the random connectivity. So if you have initial connectivity, you do this much, much, much faster. But in both cases, the network is able to learn. Now, what was learned? So what we do now is we take only this delta, only the structured part, and we look at the singular value decomposition. And what we see is that it rather quickly drops down to 0. Now it would seem, by the way, both for the 0 connectivity and for the initial connectivity. So it would seem that this is a low rank perturbation. But of course, what is exactly, is it functional? Does it mean anything? So what we do is we do a functional assay. We take these individual ranks and we lesion them one by one to see how it affects function. And you see that if you remove, let's say, rank 6 and above, then nothing really happens. So the first 5, even 4 ranks of the delta W are sufficient. So the solution found by an unconstrained gradient descent is a low rank perturbation to connectivity. And this is true for the Romo task. This is true for the Mante-Sasilo task from the Krishna Shenoy's lab and the Newsom lab. And this is also true for a flip-flop task. In all of them, we see that very few ranks are sufficient to get training. And we see that if we increase the random connectivity, then the training is much, much faster. So initial connectivity accelerates learning, and the learned connectivity is of low rank. To understand this, we move to a linear network. So now we have, instead of having we don't have some phi of x here, but we have just a linear function. So basically, we put some input through vector m, and we read it out through a vector w, and we modify the internal connectivity w using gradient descent. And then the desired output is just to reach some constant value z hat. Okay, so it can be 2, it can be half, whatever we want. And what happens is basically the same. So the performance improves, so learning is faster with initial connectivity, and the singular values, so now this is a bit of a different plot. So this is learning time, and I'm showing you all singular values, but basically one of them is non-zero, and the rest are almost 0. So only one singular value increases here. And this is the same, although it's an interesting fact that there are some qualitative differences depending on the target value, which we understand qualitatively why this happens. And what we can show in this linear case is if we solve the gradient descent, then the delta W depends on this matrix B, which of course contains W itself. So the dynamics of the network is linear, the dynamics of learning is non-linear, but we can expand that in the learning time. And in the first order, what we get is a rank 1. So this is a vector, and this is another vector. So this is sort of an outer product type. So the result of learning is a rank 1 perturbation, even though we did not constrain it to be so. And we can also understand why learning accelerates with the initial connectivity. This is related to the fact that the low rank part is highly correlated to the initial random connectivity. This is also a recent paper by Friedrich that analyzes this stuff. Okay. To conclude, complex neural signatures suggest complex models. Surprisingly, a good model for adapting complex systems like the brain could be adapting complex systems like artificial neural networks. But understanding these models requires some new concepts. And both the learning process and the final outcome can be analyzed. So a few structures in this randomness that we can already identify are that the dynamical objects are slow points and not fixed points, approximate, not exact. They act as a prior, or they provide inductive bias for the learning process. And this can also be thought of in the context of online learning and control. There's a recent paper that explores this interplay between learning and dynamics leads to quite interesting things. The low-rank perturbations, at least I was exposed to it as a trained trick in reservoir computing, but it actually arises very naturally, even without a trick. And you can also think of it, why it happens, because every complex system, it can be a brain, it can be a brain area, it can be a cell and a genetic network that has to adapt to its environment. And it does this via a narrow communication channel. So in a sense, whenever a complex system adapts to an environment via a narrow communication channel, this means that effectively you have a low-rank feedback loop. And we also show that this is the case for the topology of genetic networks, where hubs can be thought of as effective feedback loops. So I think this is a rather general theme or a type of structure or simplicity that emerges when studying these complex systems. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have a question from Tom Burns. Could the technique you described in the first study, Grid World, be applied to curriculum learning problems? Also, what would happen if you add more modularity to the RNN?
Okay, so yes, I think it can be used for curriculum learning. We have, let's see if can I switch here to slides? I'm trying to find my, okay. So for curriculum, several answers. First, it can be used as a modular. We tried it in the ICLR paper. We took a modular one that had both the landmark and the position, and we combined them, then it does get somewhat the best of both worlds. As for curriculum learning, there is another work by Doron Chaviv and Sasha Rivkind, where we basically we did curriculum learning, and just cut to the main thing here. So what we could see is how the curriculum causes fixed points or slow points to emerge gradually via learning, and why certain curricula are better than others.
I think we'll take one more. I remember, so this is from Dmitry Todorov. I remember in your paper with David, besides the slow points, also the saddles with lots of stable and few unstable dimensions were important. Do they play a role here as well?
Okay, so first of all, slow points are the analog of fixed points. So they can be both. So saddle points are a category of slow points or fixed points. And yes, so in general, there was this, let's say the flip-flop task is let's say canonical example where you have the saddle point in between. So we do, in general, we expect to find them where we have different basins of attraction. Interestingly, in many cases, we fail to find them. So this algorithm is not perfect. There's no guarantee that you will locate all the slow points. And there's, by the way, let's see if I find it here. There's another approach by Katz and Regia that also try to find these fixed points using another method, which can be thought of as an intersection of null lines, if you will. But that also doesn't have any guarantees. So I believe that these saddle points are important whenever you have separatrix, basically, but we are not always able to identify them.
Thank you. There's one more question. We'll move that to the Slack channel for this group.